be yours. May your Spirit flow and move with great power. May we be encouraged and lifted to rest in silence. Amen. Please sit down. Now, just before I begin, I want to give you a bit of a warning. This first story is a bit distressing, but it's to make a point, not to be gauche or morbid. And I promise you, we will move to light. Okay? Here we go. When I was young, some people made a very crazy decision and allowed me to be a police officer. It was a very hot, humid, sweltering day. And as you do in hot, humid, tropic, sweltering environments, you look for water to cool off. And every kid in this city was looking for water. There actually weren't a lot of calls, because quite often with heat comes fights. But it was actually quiet, and I was practicing policing by presence in a large, crowded park. And all of a sudden, a call came out, the radio came alive, a lot of people started talking, that a young lad swimming in a nearby bayou had not surfaced. I was called to respond. A little bit closer was my sergeant, Donald, and a third unit was a little bit further away, and the three of us were racing there. When I get there, my sergeant has just arrived. He's stripping off all of his kit, and he just throws it at me, and I catch it, and he's into the water, and I put it in the unit and lock it, and I run down to the water's edge. The water is becoming very muddy because he's underneath stirring it up. And he comes up for air and back down. And he comes up for air and back down. And he comes up and he's like, so many roots and so much vegetation. And of course, the alligators are watching from over there. And he disappears for a long time. And all of a sudden, he surfaces with a 14-year-old boy in the journey to man and swims with him on his hip to the shore. I'm up to my thighs in the water. I drag him out. The third unit's just arriving. He's trying to catch his breath. The two of us begin CPR. Surrounding us are mostly other kids. An unthought of nightmare is unfolding in front of them. The adults are crying, knowing that someone may get a very ugly call or knock. We work on him for several minutes, and the paramedics arrive and they take over. While the paramedics are working and I'm standing there, I can hear Donald asking, how long was he underwater before we got here? About 10 minutes. My mind is doing, he was underwater searching for another 4+ minutes. The parents arrive convulsing, sobbing, tears like you cannot imagine. Their nightmare is happening. The paramedics continue for 45 minutes, really for the pastoral care and psychological trauma for the parents and these kids. But we load this kid onto the gurney, the oxygen mask. We're helping the paramedics get it into the unit, and the three of us are to our units to clear the path in traffic to get to the A&E. We get to the A&E. A&E has been briefed. They're standing out on the ramp. They rush this kid in and work. We're standing there, wet or partially wet. And I go back to my unit, and I sit down, and I start to weep. Because I know. Finally, I get myself together, and I go in, and the paramedic's standing there. No hope, no life. Death is so cruel and so non-forgiving, and there's no do-overs. And we know that it's not supposed to be like this. We know that in our DNA it's supposed to be life. And by the way, that's why I never let you go swimming without me standing there. You see, good people, this is a summation of why I do what I do. This is a summation of why, reluctantly, people would say, you're an apostolic evangelist. It took 20 years for me to embrace that second word, 10 years to embrace the first one. But it is my heart and my passion for people to know him, sure for life here, but for life eternal. Because I know myself, and I know I can't save myself. And a lot of you in the room have reached a point in life where you know you can't save yourself. But we all know, and we celebrated last week, what was read out of Corinthians, that he lives. And he wants you to know that. And through that whole journey of our tradition of celebrating Holy Week, one day at a time, we proclaim and we beat the drum. And like a light down in Southland, every eye is drawn to the light. Every eye is drawn to life. Every eye is drawn to hope. And as we came together and we celebrated the Passover and we had the Seder dinner together, all of the laughter and fun and chaos and, yeah, we're serious with the liturgy, but you can't help but laugh. That's what Jesus calls us to. This is how you remember me. This is how you are my people. That meal together. And the next day, we came into a very dark place and room, but the medium is the message that Sunday's coming. Now you see, those Jewish days going sunset to sunset, Passover began at sundown on Thursday, and they had the meal for hours and the rest, and then the next morning, he's tried yet again and then crucified by 9 in the morning. That was an early day. A lot took place in those hours ahead of time. He's crucified at the very hour the Passover lamb in the temple is sacrificed. And he dies at the very hour that the feast of unleavened bread, bread without sin, life without sin, is broken in the temple. We see the meaning and we see the hope, but less known to us. In an age where we, as the church, have never been more ignorant to 3/4 of Scripture because of several centuries of some anti-Semitism that came about for many reasons and ways, but we associated that with them and distanced ourselves from it. Because we live at this point in history looking back and going, they didn't get it right, so the church, we've got it sorted. Yeah, right. But you see, God is always looking forward with his plan. There's no plan B. This is his plan. That everything that was talked about and promised is fulfilled. You've heard me say that a few times. But what's not known much about is that last feast, the Feast of First Fruits. You see, this thing, like Easter, lunar-based, could happen several days after Passover. But this year, every several years, it happens that next day. So they celebrated Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The sacrificial lamb is broken, no sin. And then the Feast of First Fruits the next day. Interesting. You see, there is no accidents with God. It wasn't a coincidence that it was the next day. And you've heard me say, this feast is the feast of first fruits, where they would go through their fields and tie a ribbon on those very first sheaths that were moving to bloom. And then they would cut just those sheaths as everything else started to come to bloom, and they would bring them to Passover with them, and they would offer them at the temple in real complex liturgy. You ready? Let me see your sheath. But the symbology of it is your very first, your very best, not the leftover. We tend to do that, eh? After everything's secure and we have a bit of control and we're going to be all right, then we'll give God out of leftover, maybe even a little bit sacrificial. But the first fruits are offered to God. But then the priest gives them back, and we're to take and go make unleavened bread with it. That God is going to bless us and take care of us. You see, these people, these Jewish people, had this hope in Messiah. Don't think that they thought that their sacrifice of the lambs was doing it. They knew that that was kind of a stopping measure because it went on every year, every year, every year. This complex system of 613 different prayers that are said throughout a day. The lambs constantly being slaughtered at the temple. The Kidron Valley between the Mount of Olives and the city wall, running with blood, a junkyard, wild animals after the blood and the water. They knew that it wasn't fixing it. And they looked to Passover because Passover and unleavened bread pointed forward to Messiah. They know that they are relying on God to save them. And it's always been that way. When you go back to Genesis 22, one of the framing stories of them understanding who they are, you find this fellow who didn't have a son until he was over 100. And 17 years later, God tells him, your son, the one through whom I'm going to build this nation of people that I've chosen, they haven't chosen me, I've chosen them. Bring him 3 days into the desert, note 3, and offer him to me. How insane that sounds. But Abraham trusted him so. And here's the wild part. 17-year-old strapping lad, 117, 118-year-old dad, Isaac trusted God enough too. Because there's no way Abraham was tying him up. Even if he pulled a little trickery do, he's not going to tie up a 17-year-old and sacrifice him. But God shows up and God provides the way. This line here is the line that every Jew says twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. Shema, O Israel. Yahweh is God. Yahweh is one. In fact, it's your God is one. Your God saves. Your God is there. Remember whose you belong. And it goes on to Jonah, who the 3-day theme keeps popping up again. But even more, the Jewish people form themselves around him. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, down into Egypt, slavery, and finally, the most unsuspecting hero emerges, a prince of Egypt, who rejects it and calls his people out. And their whole story of the Red Sea and its parallels to baptism and the manna, their portion provided. Most of the Torah, which we translate law, I get it because it's not a suggestion, but it's actually better translated instruction. The first 5 books of instruction. But most of their instruction of how to live as God's people reminds them that they're dependent upon God and what He did for them, therefore how they should live in their world. Treat the foreigners as native born. Remember, when they're poor and unable to support themselves because God brought you out of Egypt, remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that He saved you. And remember your God. That this whole story of God saving His people is paramount there. Now, fast forward from Moses. It's the weekend, the Passover, the Sabbath, the Feast of First Fruits that Jesus died. That city is teeming with hundreds of thousands of pilgrims. They're there for Passover and unleavened bread, and because the Feast of First Fruits is the next day, they stay on for that. But the followers of Jesus, which includes you, you're stunned. You can't believe it. Jesus talked about it, but you thought He was allegorical. Everything we hope for. I remember His eyes, His voice, twinkling His eye, His love. He was Messiah. He was going to take everything. But this Passover, I can't unsee the things I've seen. Our religious leaders, who we love and look up to and esteem so much, were spurting such vitriolic things. The Roman rulers' cruel scourging and the undefinable pain of execution on a cross. And the utter humiliation and shame of stripping him naked as he hung on that cross, to shame and belittle. And now he's dead, and we know what death looks like, because unlike today, death isn't hidden away. It's around you all the time. The dead are at your homes when they die as you prepare them. And you know what dead looks like, and there's no hope. And you're actually quite numb. And you're not sure what to do. But now it's Sunday, the Feast of First Fruits. The city is teeming with hundreds of thousands of people. So you think that you can probably go to a backwater place of worship. You're certainly not going to go to the temple. But maybe one of the backwaters, standing room only, back row where the lowest go. You go, and like every Feast of First Fruit, this passage gets read every year at the Feast of First Fruits. The hand of Yahweh was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of Elohim and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me to and fro among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? Can you even dare hope in dry bones? Then he said to me, prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of Yahweh. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath into you and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am Yahweh. And this continues, and I jump to verse 11. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We're cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am Yahweh. When I open your graves and bring you up from them, I will put my spirit in you and you will live. And I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken and I have done it. That sounds absolutely nuts. Surely it's got to be allegorical. Surely it's talking about redemption of the nation of Israel. He's not talking about something so beyond hope. Give me a break that he brings life. But if you can't embrace that, then Angus is reading about the church at Corinth, that if there's no resurrection, we're wasting our time and we should be pitied, is our truth. Because if he can't bring life to those bones, then he can't bring life to us. After you hear that in synagogue, you begin to hear the rumors that his tomb's empty, and the increase in the number of soldiers on the street and temple guards on the street, and the nervousness of anybody who's anybody. It isn't like you begin to hope, you just wonder what's going on. So you begin your trip home like Mary and Cleopas going to Emmaus, and you're from North Galilee, where the Pharisees originated, where they know the scripture the best. And it takes you the whole week, and you get home just before sundown when Sabbath begins the next week. And this whole week you've been thinking about the things that Jesus said, Torah, Passover, unleavened bread, these crazy words out of Ezekiel that you've heard every year. And you just begin to wonder what's going on. And then on that next Sabbath, you go to synagogue. You're back in Capernaum. That's the ruins of the synagogue there. The place. And you hear these words. Come, let us return to Yahweh. He has torn us to pieces, but he'll heal us. He has injured us, but he'll bind up our wounds. After 2 days, he'll revive us, and on the third day, he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. Let us acknowledge Yahweh. Let us press on to acknowledge him, and surely as the sun rises, he will appear, and he will come to us like the winter rains, like the spring rains that water the earth. Just so you know the reference of the psalmist, which is Hosea writing, the autumn rains come down heavy in Israel after a long dry spell, and things turn green in about a week. But when winter comes and the spring comes, they're often like Canterbury, very gentle, just slowly soaking the earth deep so the roots can find life again. And there's one other passage that's read on the Sabbath after the Feast of First Fruits. Isaiah. Capture the familiarity of this passage. Comfort my people, says your Elohim. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed and that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from Yahweh's hand double for all her sins. A voice of one calling, in the wilderness prepare the way for Yahweh. Make straight in the desert a highway for Elohim. Every valley will be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain. And the glory of Yahweh will be revealed, and all the people will see it together, for the mouth of Yahweh has spoken. It's interesting that in the time of Jesus, in the years that followed, it was the Roman emperors would have an advance party who would say those words. They had zero idea that they had been written hundreds of years earlier, exactly as the royal proclamation went out. A little bit of taunting. TikTok meme reels before there was such. Now look, that sounds great, and the resurrection is there. But we live in Middle Earth. We live in a time where things are complex, and there's not always hope. And we look for the light in the middle of the darkness down in Southland, driving some deserted highway, our eyes always drawn to the light. But this is hard to hold on to. But you see, the Feast of First Fruits is another one of those things pointing forward that though we're in Middle Earth, God raised him, and he will raise us. Now, you live a few more decades, even though it's a tough time in history, and you're now in Corinth. You were with Paul when he planted the church, and he left you there to help establish this church. That is a rendering from the actual foundations of what was a quite sizable city in Corinth. But most of the church there are Gentile backgrounds. They're Romanized, Greek in background. They don't have the history in 3/4 of the scripture that we have. So they didn't understand Passover and unleavened bread and first fruits. I'm sure they were teaching them, but it takes a while for that stuff to sink in. And in this meantime, Jesus is supposed to come back, and everybody expected it was going to be anytime. But their loved ones are dying, and they don't know what's going to happen to them. And so Paul, who loves this church, as pudding as they often were, wrote them the words that you had read to you. You see the top part. Basically, if he didn't rise from the dead, you're wasting your time. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who've fallen asleep. For since death came through one, life will come from one. But each in turn. Christ, the first fruits. Then when he comes, those who belong to him. Now you see the 3 feasts that took place on that weekend, first fruits, unleavened bread, and Passover, are 3 of the 4 spring feasts that point to the first coming of Jesus. In about 5 weeks from now, or 6 weeks from now, we're going to celebrate Pentecost. Pentecost was the big celebration at the end of the harvest, when everything is brought in. That's us. 4 feasts pointing forward to Messiah. 4 feasts pointing forward to God is faithful and exact and not coincidental and not accidental, but exactly as he said he would. We're not plan B because we're a pretty sad choice. Jars of clay with big cracks in them. But God's plan never stops, and he keeps working, and we're a part of that plan, and he's going to fulfill it. He's going to bring life when there's no hope. Life when you've been underwater for 10 minutes. Life when we're dry bones. Now I'm going to tell you one more story. But this one's a little better. It's 1 week later. It's the next Saturday. I'm working from heaven. Something holy about to happen. It's 1 week later. I'm driving down a boulevard. The radio comes to life. A baby has just been pulled from a pool. I'm 1 minute away. I'm the first unit there. The mom is beside herself trying to do CPR on her child, but she's in such a state that not really effective. So I ask her to take the child, and as I move to the table, which has been a table of joy and celebration, I'm holding this child head down, trying not to alarm the parent, hopefully getting some more water out of this child, and I lay them on the table and I begin CPR. I'm trying to not break the ribs and I'm trying not to blow out the lungs. I'm trying to do it forceful enough, and I'm well trained and I'm nervous. But the paramedics get there in like 3 minutes. And as I stop and they take over, I turn and ask, how long was she underwater before you got her out? Maybe a minute. How long did you work on her before I got here? Maybe 2. And then I took over. They instantly have oxygen. They're continuing the CPR on this little baby this big on this gurney. It's rolled to the ambulance. You know, the legs collapse. It's in there. The dispatch is already coordinating. There are units moving in place to block intersections so that we can get to that hospital, and I'm leading the way. And I may or may not have offended a few people coming at me in 2-lane traffic to encourage them to get off the road. Lord, forgive me. We get to the hospital. I'm shaking. The child goes in. My job is done. There's no need for me to go in. You'll come back later and do any report information. But I sit there just shaking. I can't drive. I get out and go walk around. And about half an hour later, I walk in. The paramedic looks at me, and her eyes, I couldn't read them. And she's walking towards me, and she opens her arms to hug me. I'm expecting her to tell me, no hope. But she hugs me, and she said, you saved that child's life. This is why I do what I do. Because we live too much here. Our center of perspective of living our lives is too much here. More than half the room, by the way, young ones, most of your life you will have gray hair. Just get prepared. The ones who helped start 6 p.m. service years ago have joined the rest of us. And you can look down on me, but I was where you are, and you're coming where I am. But we know that we're closer. And if he hasn't risen, then we're wasting our time. But that there was hope in life in a week that I really wrestled with God. This lad who I saw lying lifeless with a cold stare. I'm sorry that's so harsh, but it is that harsh. And this baby who, when I went in to check on the parents and get the information that you need for the reporting, blah, 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 back when you had to handwrite reports, they started crying, but this was tears of gratitude and joy. That was a good day. Our stakes are so much higher. We are a risen people of a God who chose us that we did not choose. of a risen Christ, the first fruit for us, the harvest. May we be a people of hope and joy and transformation. May we smell like Jesus to our family members and our friends. May they smell the fragrance of Christ and our sacrificial, loving attitude and postures. Now, I bet that you've got family members and friends who you think are like that 14-year-old boy, that spiritually they're just beyond hope, it ain't going to happen. I do. I'm not going to pray to end the sermon. I'm going to provide you a moment to simply take them and that relationship and leave it with God, loving God. Breathe life where it is beyond hope.